Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 311, Lysanders. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I have not got a pun or play on words related to Lysander for this introduction, so there you have it.
Oh, I thought we were going down to the beach with our buckets and shovels to look for Lysander.
Sadly, no.
Well, it's the best I could come up with on 4 seconds. So
no, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. You're always a sport in these responses. Well, this should be an interesting episode as we look at these very unique and quirky names that are repeated twice in the canon. So let's put on our thinking caps about that. And while we do, we would encourage our listeners to head over to ihose.co/trifles311, all lowercase. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website. And that's where the show notes are. And we'll have links to a few of the things we're talking about today in the show notes, as well as links to things like our Patreon. Oh, always nice to become part of the Patreon community here on Trifles. We actually have fun stuff like outtakes episodes and exclusive content for our Patreon supporters, including the ability to listen to these episodes advertising free. That's right. If our interruptive sponsor gets in your way of a good listening time, well, it's a great time to become a patron. For as little as $1 a month, you can help support the show, and it goes toward research and materials and prizes and hosting and email and all of the perfunctory stuff that's behind the podcast, things that you really don't want to be worried about. So just check that out in our show notes. Well, you say Lysander, I say Lysander. No, you say Stark, I say Starr. Something like that. Now, when we first come across the mention of a Lysander, where is that? And in what context?
Yeah, that's what I would like to know. Well, I don't know. Let me think about this for a second about in terms of which comes first. Yeah, I guess the first appearance chronologically is in The Engineer's Thumb.
Yeah.
And in The Engineer's Thumb, the great villain, the great, I think it's, someone remarks, maybe it's Hatherly, Victor Hatherly himself, I had never seen a man so thin. And I think that is Colonel Lysander Stark.
That's correct.
Otherwise known as Fritz, I think.
Fritz, yeah.
And
Fritz.
he is, of course, the chillin' villain of the case.
That is correct. He's the guy who operated the press and who decided to, do some midnight meat work with his cleaver on Victor Hatherly as he hung there on his way out of the house. He was. It's an intriguing picture, and not only mentally, as you kind of think of that description as the exceedingly thin, almost skeletal figure there, but the Sidney Paget illustration that accompanies him, I think, just kind of drills that in between the picture of Colonel Stark standing there alone, as well as the bug-eyed Colonel Stark going after Hatherly with the cleaver on the windowsill. It's just almost a figure of nightmarish proportions, as much as we could exaggerate in this case.
Yes, that's true. It's another one of these great Gothic touches, these almost Poe-like touches of a man found in a sort of a deserted place. He's disoriented, doesn't know where he is, gradually comes to realize he's surrounded by villains, makes a break for it, and then at the last minute, he's got this awful wound and huddled off into the night through an almost miraculous escape, all at the hands of this Colonel Lysander Stark.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as you say, Gothic, nightmarish. It's almost like, the dream you might have of trying to run away from somebody who's chasing you with murderous intent, and running in a barefoot on a beach, where you can't really make traction in the sand. It just feels as if they're constantly on your tail. So, but yeah, he was quite a figure. Obviously, there was enough there for Victor Hatherly to be a little suspicious. Certainly, his when he arrived at Watson's doorstep and then went to see Holmes, he very much had a reason to be fearful of Dr. Lysander Stark. I mean, Colonel Lysander Stark, I should say. He could probably count the reasons on, well, certainly one hand.
only if there were 9. Only if there were 9 reasons.
If there were 5 reasons, he could count it on one hand.
Oh, right.
If there were more than 5 reasons, he could count it on, well, I guess 1 and 4/5 hands. So I mean, as soon as he arrives and describes, what happened, there's no question that Colonel Stark is a villain. The only challenge is then tracking him down. He had a bit of a head start on the trio that was coming after him. And remind me, was this was one of the cases where Hatherly, was he able to identify where the house was? Or am I getting that mixed up with the Greek interpreter? Maybe it's the Greek interpreter.
Well, no, I think it's fairly easy to reconstruct where the house was because of the proximity of the railroad station. And of course, Hatherly makes his way there and winds up back in London. But I don't remember the details of how Holmes identified the particular dwelling. I don't remember that part of the case.
Yeah. Trying to think. So they went back out, and I know... Oh, yeah. It was it was the proximity to the station, but... Holmes noted, or Hatherly questioned the 12-mile drive, but Holmes said, well, it's 6 miles out, 6 miles back. So he made it look as if the house was farther away from the station than it actually was.
Oh, right.
It was a ruse that he had played. And, of course, they go back and they follow the smoke plumes because that pretty much indicates where the burning house is.
Yes,
where there's smoke, there's a former Lysander Stark.
There's a house on fire.
Yeah.
Well, in addition to the clever work of Sherlock Holmes in determining the location of the scene where this awful crime happened. There's been a lot of work by irregulars to track down the roots of this name. And the great Sherlockian, our friend Peter Blau, has produced quite a lot of thinking about this. In his paper in the Baker Street Journal, Peter points out that the engineer's thumb took place in the summer of 1889, and that this colonel, this so-called colonel, Lysander Stark, probably took his pseudonym a year earlier, because that's when the other engineer, Jeremiah Haling, was murdered, performing the same sort of routine that Victor Hatherly was hired to undertake for these counterfeiters. And Peter points out that around that time, Lysander Starr Jameson was in the news around that time for his work in Rhodesia. And I think this is something, too, that Christopher Morley suggested for the first time back in 1948. But what happened 20 years later in 1968, which I think is the time Peter wrote this paper, was there was reporting on a new stamp issue of Rhodesia, which honored the 50th anniversary of the death of Lysander Starr Jameson. And Jameson was, an interesting guy. He was born in Edinburgh, interestingly enough, about a year before Sherlock Holmes. And he was a statesman in southern Africa. Now, again, Peter's paper is happening in the 1960s. Christopher Morley is observing this in the 1940s. And Jameson, Lysander Starr Jameson, was a collaborator of Cecil Rhodes. And Jameson was known primarily because of his abortive raid into the Transvaal to overthrow the Boer government in 1895. And interestingly enough, Jameson studied medicine at University College London. But instead of doing all that, he wound up going to the diamond mines in southern Africa, and that's where he met Cecil Rhodes. And, the big problem with Cecil Rhodes' dream to bring all of South Africa together under the British was this Boer government of the Transvaal Republic. And that's basically why Rhodes plotted with Jameson and others to overthrow the government there. And we all know what happened after that, which was in all the papers.
Yeah. Well, and that's why we have Zimbabwe today.
Yes.
No longer Rhodesia.
Yes.
As it has reverted to its roots. So interesting there. We have some kind of engineering connection. We have a military connection. We certainly have a name connection. It's very close. Lysander Starr Jameson to Colonel Lysander Stark. And it would have been on Conan Doyle's mind at the time.
Yeah.
So let's take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll have a conversation about the other Lysander and some other influences. Stay tuned. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. And of course, the EBSJ is a great way to go back and read this Peter Blau article that we reference. It is in volume 18, number 2 of the Baker Street Journal from 1968. Well, I would imagine everyone's figured out the other Lysander, because there are only 2 in the entirety of the Sherlock Holmes canon. The other Lysander is Dr. Lysander Starr, Starr, one-letter difference from Lysander Stark. So this, again, kind of another connection with Lysander Starr Jameson. We actually get the star this time. But where does this Lysander appear, Bert?
Well, this Lysander appears in the case called the Three Garridebs, which chronologists, just for those of the small number of you who are really interested in chronology, I hear everyone else cringing as I use the word chronology. The engineer's thumb is widely thought to have taken place in September of 1889. The Three Garridebs took place, we believe, in June of 1902. And the interesting thing about that, and what happens there, of course, is that Holmes trips up a villain's alibi or a presentation of his background by introducing the name of a completely fictional person, Lysander Starr of Topeka, Kansas. But in that time, May 1902, it turns out that Lysander Starr Jameson was named as an executor of the will of Cecil Rhodes. And it would therefore have been easy for Holmes to recall that name a month later when he invented this fictional mayor of Topeka, Kansas in the Three Garridebs. And of course, in the early part of 1902 as well, Conan Doyle, the literary agent, was volunteering at a field hospital in South Africa, because this was when the Second Boer War was happening. And he was also probably familiar with Jameson in news reports. So this is more support for this one particular point of view that says, this fellow Lysander Starr Jameson is the root of Lysander Starr and Lysander Stark. But there are, other opinions about that.
Well, it's a really, really solid connection, and the timing just works out well. I tend to think that if Killer Evans, who was posing as Garrideb here, John Garrideb, if he had really done his homework on Sherlock Holmes, don't you think he would have read up on all of the published stories at that point? And when Holmes said, I used to have a correspondent, he's dead now, old Dr. Lysander Starr, who was mayor of Topeka in 1890. And don't you think Evans would have said, "Oh, Mr. Holmes, I think you're confusing him with Colonel Lysander Stark, who appeared in the Engineer's Thumb that good old Dr. Watson wrote here."
Oh, I like that. That's great. Yeah, of course, because the Engineer's Thumb was in the Adventures. So that
Right.
would have been out a long while ago.
It would have only been 10 years since it came out. So, it still would have very much been in the public's consciousness at that point. So if he really wanted to play his mark, if he was really that good of a con man, he certainly would have taken that route. But of course, Evans was really more of a bank robber than anything else. Not a bank robber, but he stole the Bank of England plates and hid them. So he was an excellent larcenist, but not so good a con man. But interestingly, also around the 1890s, when Conan Doyle wrote the Five Orange Pips, he would have been living in Portsmouth, right, in Southsea. And there's a chart here from a wonderful book by Donald Redmond. It's called Sherlock Holmes: A Study in Sources. And I think it was published back in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, 1982. And in this chart, we look at Conan Doyle's residency from 1886 to the spring of 1891, lived in Portsmouth and the vicinity, and other neighbors who lived around him included, at 9 Hampshire Terrace, a certain Dr. Lysander Maybury, who is a police surgeon. And Redmond has it down here that it is a high probability that he partially influenced the name of Colonel Lysander Stark. So, you put that together in the flow into the Boer War and everything from 1902, it just all kind of solidifies itself.
It does, but isn't it interesting that today, in the 21st century, when we are seeing so many names that have not been long used to name children come back.
Yeah.
My grandmother, my mother's mother, may she rest in peace, had 3 sisters, Clara, Fanny, and Minnie. And it's amazing the number of Claras and Minnies that are around today. And here we are visiting this time around the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, when there really were people named Lysander. And of course, for those of us who are fond of the classics, Lysander has an important identity.
He does. He's got a couple of identities. And if we want to go back the furthest, he was a Spartan military and political leader from around 400 BC or so. He is probably most famous for destroying the Athenian fleet in 405 BC, which forced Athens to give in, and that brought the Peloponnesian War to an end. And that meant that Sparta was dominant for the next decade or so under his leadership. So Lysander, as a military and political leader, was extraordinarily well regarded. But when you look at his legacy, right, when the historians who came not too long after him took a look at him in the Roman era, he was shown to be, who was it? Cornelius Nepos, the Roman biographer, charged him with cruelty and perfidy.
Boy, I hate to be charged with perfidy. When people charge me with perfidy, I'm the first one on the phone to my lawyer.
Well, you know what they say, perfidy is the enemy of good. Yes.
But isn't it interesting, a time when people would name their children after great classical generals and strong, powerful characters like that. I wonder if there are any people today naming their children Lysander, because there are people in my own circle who I know have just recently named children, for example, Hector and Hutch. So there's another family I know has named a child Hutch, and there are all sorts of names coming back.
Yeah. Well, I had a Greek friend in college whose name was Testicles. No, Hercules. It was Hercules. That's
Heracles.
Heracles, Hercules. Yeah. No, I think I've shared this with you before. There was a stand-up routine that the comedian Dennis Wolfberg did on the Tonight Show years ago, and he and his wife were preparing to have their first child, and he said, typically in the Jewish tradition, a child is named after a recently deceased member of the family. He said, like my one cousin who we named Grandpa, or they're named after some biblical figure, like my other cousin Snake, obviously from the Old Testament.
I like that.
Yeah.
There's a name.
But there is a Lysander out of literature from the mind of Shakespeare, no less. We have Lysander from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And, lo and behold, he's from Athens. How do you like that?
Yeah, what a surprise.
And he falls in love with Hermia. And, of course, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, everyone's under a spell. And during this spell, he falls in love with Helen instead. And when he does that, he treats Hermia very badly. Now, of course, everyone wakes up when the spell wears off, and, all's well that ends well, as they say. But in the meantime, once more, the name Lysander was associated with some kind of poor behavior, where we kind of look at and shake our heads and say tisk tisk at Lysander's behavior.
Not the done thing. Well, this is just part of what we find in the panoply of characters that populate the world of Sherlock Holmes, the Lysander Starrs, the Lysander Starks. What does it all mean? You know, this constant reemergence. You could take these Lysanders and put them next to the violets that keep recurring, and then what would you have?
Just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
By the way, Mr. Garrideb, how strange that you should come from Topeka. I had a correspondent there. He's dead now, lad. Dr. Lysander Starr. Do you remember him, Watson?
Oh, yes, clearly.
He was the mayor there in 1890, I believe. Did you ever cross paths?
Of course, good old Dr. Starr. In Topeka, his name is still honored, Mr. Holmes. Well, much to do, little time to do it, and I'll say goodbye to you now, gentlemen. I must on with my search. Perhaps we may report any progress to each other within a day or two. I bid you good day. Good day to one and all.
Good day. Good day to one and all.
Lysander Starr, eh?
Yes, I wondered if you'd recognize the name.
Take away an R and add a K to the second name and you have Lysander Stark, from The Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb.
Murderer, a counterfeiter, and certainly no mayor of Topeka.